we ended up doing more experiments and more things that were close to experiments.
In this week's podcast of the Mixtape, the podcast, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Guido Imbens, Stanford University. Dr. Imbens is the 2021 co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, which he won with Josh Angrist and David Card. Dr. Imbens is also a distinguished scientist at Amazon and has been credited he was credited in his Nobel Prize. The Nobel Committee credited the prize for his pioneering work on the local average treatment effect and instrumental variables in his work in the 1990s with Josh Angrist. As always, I appreciate you coming and listening to the podcast. I'm Scott Cunningham. Okay, so today I have the pleasure of having Guido Imbens, the October who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in October. It's really great to see you again, Guido. I wanted to say, I still remember the first time we met. We were at our annual professional conference for economists, and I basically cold called you and asked if you wanted to come have a beer with a few of us to watch the Alabama-Georgia championship game, and you came, and you didn't know any of us, and I've always thought, this is how I think of Guido Imbens: socially, extremely friendly, unassuming, very kind, very open. And so it's really nice to get a chance to talk to you again.
Oh yeah, so I have good memories from watching that game, and I appreciate the invitation at the time.
Yeah,
so it was fun, and the sending that invitation was a good idea, and kind of the things you've been doing for the profession.
Oh.
With the AEA 5K,
yeah,
where I won my other award last year.
Yeah,
I think that's a great idea. I think we kind of need to have more of that type of thing. I don't think the profession does a particularly good job.
Yeah,
in making everybody feel part of that, and I think this type of activity is actually super helpful in building more of a community.
Yeah, I was just about to say that you had a big year. You won two big prizes. You won the Kaplan-Nailbuff Award for coming in the 64th percentile.
Exactly. I tried to win it again this year, and I slowed down a little bit. So I think it came in around the 80th percentile or something.
That's right. It's harder to nail that one. That's not, you can't manipulate the running variable on that one very easily.
No, exactly. So it's but
well, so I wanted to start and I'd broken up my interview notes into basically three things: the past, this period of time, maybe just talking about career setbacks, as well as the future. And so the first thing I was wanting to tell you is this morning, my mom, like a lot of people, loves Wordle, and she was telling me that she loves it because it's a puzzle. Unlike crossword puzzles, which to her is not a puzzle. And it reminded me of something that I heard you say. You said your passion for econometrics came in childhood because of your love of chess. And I was curious about that because I don't think people have probably heard that before. A lot of people play chess but don't know that about econometrics.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Netherlands. So there, the educational system is a little different. It's kind of more like the German system. So you don't apply for a particular college or particular university as much as you apply for a particular major. So while in high school, you need to apply to study mathematics in a particular place, or languages, or the sociology or psychology. And so I wanted to do something that was like mathematics because I enjoyed it. I felt I was good at it, but I didn't want to do pure mathematics. So I was kind of trying to figure out what to do. And my economics teacher in high school gave me this book by Tim Bergen, this kind of thin book about econometrics. And I'm not sure I really made that much of it, but it sort of did seem like a good combination of having a lot of mathematics in it, but also having some relevance. Tim Bergen was kind of a very famous person in Holland, not just kind of for his scientific work, but he'd done a lot of public policy work. He'd set up essentially the equivalent in Holland of the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And so he'd done a lot of work trying to make economics very relevant for policy, for government work. And so that was very inspiring. And it was kind of even beyond the work he'd done there. He was a very inspiring figure in the way after the uprising in Hungary, he'd actually taken in the Hungarian refugees in his house. He'd done a lot of work for the League of Nations before World War II, and so he was just generally regarded as a very inspiring figure. And so the book kind of motivated me, inspired me to go study econometrics. That was actually a program he'd set up in Rotterdam, and so that seemed a very natural choice for me at that point. So I didn't really know exactly what I was getting into.
But so from the very beginning, you were interested in econometrics.
Well, I'm not sure I was really that much interested in it because I didn't really have that much of an idea what it really was. But it seemed like a reasonable choice. In that it ticked off a bunch of boxes, and then it turned out to be a very good fit.
Yeah.
But so going back to the puzzle aspect of it as well, that certainly kind of motivated me. I liked the idea of solving puzzles. In some sense, a challenge for me has always been to make sure that I was working on the right puzzles, and that I was working on things that were actually of some general interest.
Right.
And there, I'm not sure I was very good early on in picking good problems.
What were you interested in? What were you interested in your PhD program? You followed. I just now I'm drawing a blank, but you followed someone to Brown.
Yeah. So I worked. So I from Rotterdam, I'd gone on to some exchange program to England, to Hull in the north of England. Not for any particular reason, and not because I knew anything about the university, but just because there was a exchange program and it was sort of a way of going to England for a year, and that seemed an exciting idea.
Yeah.
Then when I got there, it turned out there was a econometrician there, Tony Lancaster, was actually very good, and then there was another Dutch econometrics student who came same time. And so he was very happy having these econometrics students there. And then it turned out he was about to move to the US, to Brown. And he asked us if we were interested in doing a PhD there. So that's how I ended up at Brown. I applied to a couple of other places, but I didn't get into a lot of places. Just nobody from Hull had ever really applied to those programs before, so they didn't really know what to make of me.
Right.
But that I got to Brown, and that turned out to be a good fit. That was actually a very nice program, and I had a great time there.
Is it common in your econometrics community and amongst your friends and others to have been, sort of influenced by singular people like Tim Bergen or Lancaster? Are you sort of, is there something about something about you that's sort of been impacted by particular people?
No, actually, I think at some level there've been a lot over the years. There've been a lot of people who had a big influence on my work and my way of thinking about problems. At some point, I remember one of my co-authors giving a talk, Richard Spady, when I was at Harvard, and then one of the students I was working with at the time said, wow, you kind of have a really eclectic set of co-authors, and he was referring to kind of Josh Angrist and Don Rubin and Richard Spady. And there were kind of a bunch of people, and they were all quite different in their styles and in the problems they were working on. And I think at that time I was very flexible in my views, and I was kind of interested in learning from these different people.
Yeah.
In some sense, I've sort of kept doing that. When I was when I moved to UCLA, I taught a class with Ed Leamer, who was also someone I've learned an enormous amount from. We never actually wrote a paper together, but he was very influential in my thinking about the econometrics and about what are good problems to work on.
He was very critical of econometrics at the time. What do you think what do you think he would have think about? What did he think about the direction that you were going on?
Well, so that's a very interesting question, and I'll have a better answer in a couple of weeks. But I agree kind of with all his criticisms in his let's take the con out of econometrics paper. But he kind of suggested the direction to resolve these things by doing sensitivity analysis. And in some sense that didn't catch on nearly as much as it should have, probably, but partly because he missed or he underestimated the fact that people were going to do experiments and kind of do just more credible work where the sensitivity analysis was less of an issue. And in that paper, he writes at some point, well, I'm not really talking about experimental work because these problems are not as important. And I think left and said was his view that, well, but we're not doing experiments, so we don't really need to think about that as much. And it turned out to not be quite right, because we actually ended up doing more experiments and more things that were close to experiments than I think he envisioned. Yeah. But actually, so the reason I said is I'll know more in 2 weeks. He's actually giving a guest lecture in my graduate class in 2 weeks. So I asked him to come over and kind of talk about his views on econometrics now and kind of what he was thinking at the time, because that paper was hugely important in my thinking, and it actually featured not just in my lecture but also in Josh and David's lectures. I think it was very influential for them as well. And, it's a paper that's got a lot of attention, but still not nearly as much, I think, as its importance would justify. Yeah,
it's because I'm 46 and graduated in 07. I've only lived in your timeline. I've only lived in the wake of your work, so I don't really know what it was like at the beginning. And so, am I right that this was the work that you were doing with Angrist and Rubin wasn't always received well within the econometrics community, or that's not really the way things were?
Yeah, no, I mean that's right. There was, I think, early on there were a number of people who thought this was really interesting and really innovative. So Gary Chamberlain was kind of a big fan of the work early on, but also people like Whitney Newey thought it was very interesting early on, and so I remember the first time I presented it at Harvard, and people were very curious about it. But at the same time, and so possibly kind of partly the reason for why people were curious, because there was also a lot of people who thought, no, this was the wrong way to go. This was kind of just not the way things were being done. And they, I think one of the the specific criticism was that, you should start by saying what you're interested in. You should be clear about what you're interested in, and then focus on estimating that.
Right.
And what we did was kind of turn that around a little bit. We said, well, maybe you're interested in the average effect, but you can't get that, and so we'll just take what you can get.
Right. So, that was dissatisfying to some people.
Well, people felt that was sort of cheating a little bit, saying, well, right. They felt that was exposed, kind of justifying doing what you were doing rather than being principled about trying to estimate something and figuring out how to best get at that.
So why did you and Josh and Ruben end up kind of going down that route if that was so not the way things were done?
Well, so from my perspective, the motivation came out of kind of this tension between Josh's thesis, kind of with the draft lottery, kind of where you had this instrument that seemed very credible, but it was only moving the fraction of veterans kind of from about 15 to 30% or something. And so there had been these papers by Heckman and Mansky in the Papers and Proceedings in 1990, where they kind of both argued that you couldn't actually identify the average effect of veteran status in cases like that. They weren't looking at that example, but they said if you want to get the average effect of some treatment using an instrument, unless the instrument moves the probability of getting the treatment from 0 to 1, you can't get the average effect.
Right.
And so kind of on the one hand, there were these negative results saying, no, you cannot get the average effect. And on the other hand, there was this application that seemed very credible. That seemed like pretty much the best you could do, but it was very far from moving the treatment probability from 0 to 1. So we try to understand that the tension and see if there was something credible you could learn from that. If it was not, and we didn't quite formulate it initially that way, but if you couldn't get the overall average, was there something else you could get? And so Mansky said, well, you could get the bounds, but that didn't seem quite enough for policy in a lot of cases. And so we wanted to resolve that. And initially, from my perspective, we were very neutral about it. We didn't say the local average treatment effect is the thing you're interested in. It was just, that's what you're getting.
Yeah, right.
Understanding that seemed useful to us. And,
so was the potential outcomes model, if you had to rank its importance in making those discoveries about the late theorem, I mean, were you going to get to it anyway, or is potential outcomes just really opening it up?
No, I think that really opened it up. Exposed the math is very, very simple. So initially there's two things there. But so initially we set up the selection problem itself in terms of a latent index model,
right? Where
there's some latent D star that follows some model, and if that crosses a threshold, you serve in the military, and otherwise you don't.
Right.
And so we got the late result in that way. It looks very messy that way because we said, well, we have a continuous unobserved thing, and so we could have these integrals and stuff, and that. But the basic result was there. But then Gary Chamberlain said, well, actually, you could also think of the treatment status in terms of potential outcomes. And that then kind of the proof simplifies to being 2 or 3 lines, and it just becomes much, much crisper. And in fact, that also, so Don Rubin made a similar comment where he kind of looked at the argument and said, well, this kind of looks interesting, but it looks if this is true, then really there should be a 2-line proof. There shouldn't be kind of a page of kind of integrals and stuff.
Right.
And they were both right. And I think that really simplified the exposition and made it much more, much clearer and much better.
Yeah.
So I think the potential outcome setup there was hugely important. And I actually remember at that time reading Rubens, I think it's a 77 paper in the Journal of Educational Psychology.
Yeah.
Where essentially all he does is talk about, you want to think of causal effects as the difference between Y of C and Y of T.
Yeah.
It's this contrast. And I remember reading that paper thinking, wow, that's actually a very helpful way of formulating the problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is just much clearer than starting with these modeling things purely in terms of the observed outcomes.
Right.
And later, sort of around that, well, a little later, but sort of influenced by that, I wrote this book review of Henry's book on kind of with econometrics readings, where I looked back at Timberger's work, where for the supply and demand for the simultaneous equation setup, he starts off being very clear in terms of the potential outcomes in a way that still resonates a lot with me. And it's kind of interesting to see how the econometricians then generalize that kind of to these simultaneous equations models with K endogenous variables and M exogenous ones, but doing it purely in terms of the realized outcomes.
Right.
And that, I think at that point, a lot of the clarity was lost.
Yeah.
And we lost kind of the statistics part of the audience because it didn't really, it wasn't very clear what was meant anymore.
That reminds me
I think the potential outcomes are a big part of make that so clear.
That reminds me of your fish paper with Guido Imbens. It seems like that's a explicit remapping back to supply and demand.
Yeah, no, that was the goal of that paper, kind of just be go back to kind of the Timberg and Havelmo setup, and then kind of showing what that gets you in these nonlinear, non-homogeneous settings.
Yeah. Well, so it's funny. I feel like they sometimes say, we've only had like a dozen recessions, in recorded history. So we are still kind of learning what they are. And I kind of feel like similar about econometrics. We've only seen like a few of these big bursts of influence over the 20th century, but it seems like the spreading of your work through the applied community is really impressive. And, when I think about how we're all Imbenites, it's like, it's not because the work ended up in Green's econometrics textbook, or it's like it moved through the applied community. Is that accurate, or what did it look like for you back then?
Well, so I mean, certainly at the time, I don't know. I thought the local average treatment effect paper, was very interesting. I remember kind of when we sort of finished the final piece, and I was just extremely pleased with the way that turned out. I felt we'd really figured out something that people hadn't seen before.
Yeah.
So I was very happy with it, but I didn't really have any expectations that this would be some hugely influential piece of work. I was just happy with having figured that out.
Right.
Now, sort of what happened subsequently, I think partly the potential outcome setup was very helpful, and I think, there's sort of lots of controversy sort of about exactly who should be getting credit for that. And so it's certainly clear that it was explicit in Neyman, it's sort of explicit in Tinbergen and Havelmo, but it had gone lost in the econometrics literature, and Rubin's work brought that back. You can see it. It brought it back, and that became more prevalent in econometrics prior to my work with Josh. You see that in the 1990 Heckman and the 1990 Munsky papers, and some of the papers around that time. But I think that did make the statements of the problems just much clearer. Yeah. If you go back to the earlier empirical work that Lima was criticizing, kind of one of the things you would see in those days in empirical work is that people would put in these tables and try to interpret and report all the different coefficients. You would have a linear regression with some variable of interest, some variable whose causal effect you're interested in, and then you would have a bunch of other things, but people would still look at all these other coefficients and interpret them essentially the same way. There was really no distinction kind of between causal variables and attributes, where the setting things up with the potential outcomes helped being very clear about what are actually the things you're interested in.
Yeah.
And what is the distinction between that and attributes?
Right. I love hearing the stories. I think that it's funny when you read the econometrics textbooks, you just kind of like, oh, it's just kind of drop down with Moses on Mount Sinai. We're just kind of born with these estimators, and it's funny. I just never really, I love hearing about the fights and the arguments and the seminars and the way it moved. But you had this fairly significant career setback. Is that right? You were denied tenure at Harvard.
Yeah. Well, I went to graduate school at Brown, so I was extremely fortunate to get a job at Harvard.
Yeah,
and I don't say sort of extremely fortunate there lightly. They didn't actually interview me at the meetings. The job market system was already the same as it is now. You have these interviews, then you have these seminars. But so they didn't interview me at the meetings. But then it turned out they were losing two of their junior faculty that year, and so they realized actually they were going to be very short in terms of teaching their courses, and so they were a little desperate to get someone to teach the courses that nobody else wanted to teach.
Yeah.
The probability and stats course. So then after the meetings, after they had realized they didn't see anybody at the meetings, Gary Chamberlain called me up and sort of interviewed me over the phone. I said, well, what are you working on? What is your this work about? And then he decided to then he invited me to give a talk. And so it was kind of fairly informal. I don't think even there was it was basically him on his own deciding that. And so then he gave a seminar there, and they decided, okay, sure, we'll take a chance. Josh was actually not particularly in favor. So shame on him.
He's not calling every. He's not good at calling every horse race, apparently.
No. At some level, I have sympathy for that. I don't think I was doing very particularly interesting work at that time, but it was competent. It wasn't very inspired.
Yeah.
And but Gary Chamberlain, who was much wiser than either Josh or me, said, this is good. We'll take a chance. And so, and then Josh, to his credit, didn't sulk, but he actually started talking to me, trying to make sure that I was actually working on more interesting things.
Yeah. Well, so did you have a sense that your tenure denial was probable, or what's it like at Harvard? I mean, it's
no,
gotta be.
I think at Harvard, so it's in those days, and it's probably still true, the tenure, the probabilities are very low. And so I was just very happy when I got there. I was very happy to get the chance to go there. I was extremely happy with my experience there, kind of the connecting with Josh, working with, I also did some work with Gary Chamberlain, the work with Ruba. So I was just very happy with my experience there. Then when I was up for tenure, I wasn't really sure how that was gonna go. I didn't have a huge number of papers at a time. I thought they were good, but I really was not sure which way it would turn out. I think it was a very reasonable thing for them to think that I was sort of close to the margin, and so I think that was not a unreasonable decision. It was hard to evaluate the local average treatment effect paper had come out, but it wasn't clear yet. That took a while to really get traction.
Right.
So I think that was a difficult thing to evaluate. So I and in some sense, I wanted to get tenure there, and I was hoping I was getting tenure there, but I certainly wasn't expecting it. I wasn't expecting to get turned down either. I was genuinely unsure which way that would go. Yeah. And then turned out for my career, it was probably incredibly good to go to UCLA and just broaden my horizons. It's very good to go to another place for a while and kind of see how people think there, what kind of problems people are working on. And so there at UCLA, I ended up working a lot with Joe Hotz. I talked a lot. I learned a lot from Ed Leamer. So it was actually very, very good. And then later I had the opportunity to go to Berkeley. Yeah. And have David Card as my colleague. And so those were all incredibly good experiences.
Yeah. How have you, how do you deal with disappointment like that? Is there something that you've learned over the years to just how disappointment affects you and how you work through it?
Yeah, so the tenure disappointment in some sense was partly mitigated by the fact that I was very excited getting to LA. I hadn't spent much time in California up to that point. Yeah. And then when I got there, actually it turns out it's incredibly nice there in LA. Really nice. I lived in Santa Monica, and that was very pleasant. Yeah. It was good to go to a different place where then from the beginning you play a very different role. And so there at UCLA, I was a senior tenured faculty, and so the people there were very happy to have me there. I could kind of choose how to had influence in reorganizing the econometrics program. And deciding what I thought was important for the students to study. And so it was good kind of maturing in the profession in that way. Yeah.
It fits my view of you as someone who is not in a topical way, just genuinely a person who sees possibilities, even the way you're describing, like learning from other people, just the openness to, that you don't really know how the openness to new things. Is that kind of, do you think that was helpful in navigating those things?
Yeah. So yes, some of that's right. But I think probably over the years, I've lost some of that. I think the being open to new ideas is actually, it's very hard. And I think initially, sort of the time I met Josh, the time I met Don, was a time I was very willing to listen to new ideas and new ways of thinking about problems. I didn't have very set views on how econometrics should be done.
Yeah.
I think now it would be much harder for me to be. I think now it's much more of a challenge to kind of be open to very.
So if Yuta Pearl comes into your classroom and tries to convince you to start drawing stuff, is he going to be as successful now as he would have been?
No, so in fact, I think, and I don't know when this was. I think this was late 90s. This may have been when I was at UCLA. They actually asked me if he wanted to write a paper with him, kind of on nags, and kind of explain this to economists. And I said, well, this is kind of interesting. I think it's worth doing, but this is kind of not what I'm doing at the moment. And so at that point, I felt I had I had my own research agenda, and I'm not going to do everything that I could be doing. I'm going to pick which things, are in line with my views on what is useful for empirical work. And I felt writing a paper expositing graphical methods,
right?
I think that's sort of worth doing. And in some sense, I wrote this paper for the Journal of Economic Literature a couple of years ago, giving my view on that. But it would be very hard to write that type of paper with a co-author who might have different views on exactly what works. Yeah. And I think that's kind of a challenge. That was not as much of a challenge for me early on, where my views were not as well formed, and I was happy kind of to discuss these and figure these things out. But now, working with new co-authors, with senior co-authors who have strong views themselves, is much harder. I did write this paper at some point with Chuck Mansky, where we do have fairly different views on some topics, but we were aligned on a particular thing, and so I had a great experience actually working with him. But I think there, over time, you become a little less flexible. So you can try fight that, but it's hard. Yeah.
Well, so when I think of you, because I don't know your full, because I'm not an econometrician, I don't know the full corpus of your work. I think about it as the things I've kind of learned over the years, and I think about you with Angrist, Rubin, Alberto Abadi, and then Susan Athey. And I was just wondering, what's kind of the common, you've been so successful in those collaborations. What's kind of been the common sort of secret, or what is about that is similar, and what about each of those has been a little different?
Well, kind of collaborating with people on this type of work, where it's conceptual work. I think you do need to be very aligned in terms of the overall view.
Right.
With the sort of papers. Again, so I think very highly of Pearl's work. I think it's incredibly important. But I think that but there's kind of a lot of papers now that I think are very good that I wouldn't want to write. And so when I collaborate with people, I need to be someone in sync with their views on problems, and even kind of a little bit on the style of writing papers. And so with Josh, I go way back, and so I understand how he thinks about these problems, and I really value his views. I kind of same with that was the same with Gary Chamberlain when I worked with him, who was incredibly influential for shaping my views. And it's the same with Alberto and Susan. With Alberto, kind of I have this whole sequence of papers where we just work very closely together, and he's just incredible to work with. Of course, the same with Susan, but it's because these people are all so good. It is very hard because they all have different views on some of these things, and so it takes a lot of mutual respect to be able to work effectively with those people.
Yeah. Well, of all of them, the one that surprises me the most would be Susan, because of her, her IO and micro theory and just this distinguished prior career. I was telling somebody, she'll when she wins the Nobel, there'll be this like early Susan, late Susan, that they will be so different because I didn't really always see her as an econometrician, and she so clearly is one of the most important econometricians now. And I was just wondering, was that a collaboration that you saw coming? And has that been?
No. The difference with Susan is she's incredibly broad and incredibly fast. So she's very fast at getting up to speed in different areas. And so she kind of really got started in the machine learning literature because she was working with people at Microsoft. She was chief economist there. And so she was talking to all the people there about their problems. And so at that point, I hadn't really paid much attention to that literature. I'd seen a little bit kind of Tip Sharani's lasso stuff, and I thought that was interesting, but I didn't really appreciate the importance of a lot of the machine learning stuff. But so Susan got into that, and she was telling me about these things. And so at that point, kind of unlike the early 90s when I just started out, it was much harder for me to kind of get interested in new things because I was much busier. I had much less time for kind of just reading new things. But Susan was doing more and more of that stuff. So at some point I got more and more curious about what that was about. And so then she convinced me that these were actually really important things. And so we started thinking about these machine learning problems, and turned out she was right. These are actually just incredibly important things. And so the way I see it kind of over the arc of my career, the causal stuff has changed econometrics a huge amount, but now all the machine learning stuff is really the other big change in the way I think about econometrics, and the way we practice is changing, partly fueled by the empirical work, partly fueled by technical innovations. But those are just the two big changes. And Susan was without Susan kind of being interested in those things, I probably would have been much slower in moving in that direction as well.
I mean, I don't quite know how to articulate this, but the synergies between the PhD economics labor market and tech seems to be kind of bridging a little bit on y'all's work of this machine learning causal inference, because the sense I get is that, the first mover advantage in tech was machine learning. And so causal inference is kind of coming later. but it seems like it's in really huge demand. And the view is that, econometrics in your work in particular, and the work with Susan has got a lot of value. Is how collaborative, what's that interaction been like with commerce, with tech, on your own, what you're seeing in terms of this causal inference econometrics?
It's been very interesting. And so I hadn't really anticipated that moving here. When Susan and I moved here in 2012, I wasn't really focused on that as much. Again, Susan at that time was already working with Microsoft, so she had a better sense of the opportunities there. But initially, when I came here, I wasn't interacting that much with those companies. So I set up this seminar here, kind of a more data science seminar, and I had some people from the tech companies, from Facebook, Google, coming and giving talks. And in fact, I spent the summer as an intern at Facebook, kind of just talking to the people there.
Yeah,
and
because you have a few social network estimating causal effects off a social network, one with Dean Eccles, right?
Yeah, the paper with Dean Eccles was written that summer. And but it was partly for me to kind of understand that I was interested in what type of problems they were interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And then a little later, Pat Byrie asked me to give some lectures at Amazon, and I did that. And then he said, well, do you want to come and talk to us more regularly? And so I started doing that. And that's just been really interesting.
Yeah.
Just actually seeing what problems they're interested in, what questions they think are important.
Yeah.
And then thinking about how, for some of them, the econometrics is there. For some of them, we know how to answer those things, but there's a lot of questions that we haven't actually thought about. And so it's been very inspiring to talk to the people there and to develop new methods motivated by that. I say I have two papers with Susan and Raj Chetty that are kind of partly motivated by some of the substantive problems Raj was working on, partly motivated by some of the problems I've seen in the tech world, kind of on combining experimental and observational data. And but from my perspective, part of the motivation just came from talking to people at the various companies, kind of thinking about how they're analyzing data, how they're making decisions. And so it's been very inspiring.
Yeah. Where do you see all this now that, it seems like causal inference is very mature? I mean, it's funny. I've taught it so many times now, and think about your work a lot, and think about it in a different way though, because I'm not an econometrician, so I'm always trying to figure out the lines back. It's funny to think, if you see causal inference in terms of Neiman and Fisher, what an incredible body of work now exists that just is just as important as the randomized control trial, which to a lot of people they wouldn't believe me.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I think sort of ever since econometrics got founded as a discipline sort of in the 1920s, I think the causal inference was implicitly a big part of that. And you can look at Sewell Wright's work, you can look at the work by Timberg and or Havelmo. It was sort of it wasn't explicit there about causality, but it was sort of clear that it was not explicit in the sense that they were not actually using the word causal as much as we do now.
Right.
But that's what they were interested in. And all the structural econometrics kind of in the 50s and 60s, all the Coles Foundation stuff was all about structural causal effects.
Right.
And so there's some kind of relabeling, but I think the language matters, and kind of being explicit that some of the things we look at are causal and some are not.
Yeah,
is very helpful.
Yeah,
but and clearly a lot of has been done in the last 30 years on that. But the questions kind of were always there, and so I think some of the division between reduced form and structural work, I think some of the labeling there is not very fortunate. Clearly the instrumental variables work, going back again to Wright and Timber, was structural. It was kind of very different from the type of work people were doing in the statistics literature, and so I see the local average treatment effect work as fitting in that line.
Yeah. That's right. Well, so I mean, that's interesting. So I guess my last question is, where do you see, so some young person is picking up Angrist and Imbens 94 and Imbens and Rubin 2015, the way you did with Tim Bergen, and just getting inspired. Where do you see things going now with these, with the developments in causal inference, kind of this lineage of work that I kind of see in your wake? Where do you see it going in the future?
Well, so I think and I think there's some work going in that direction. We need to integrate kind of some of the theory and the empirical work, kind of what you see in the good empirical work these days, and that goes even towards the design of experiments. One of the things I'm working on at the moment is looking at the design of experiments in settings where there's complicated patterns of interference or spillovers. And so it's sort of clear that you can't allow for unrestricted patterns of spillovers. If everybody affects everybody else, then you're kind of stuck, because you don't have repeated samples or replicates of the. But you can do much better than saying that everybody is separate. Right. And so there, I think, economists are used to thinking about how people interact, and especially in marketplaces, we put a lot of structure on how people interact. And so there's this very interesting work going on doing experimental designs in these marketplaces. Stefan Varga has some work there where he looks at settings where the spillovers come purely through prices. And I've done some work where you do experiments kind of in settings where you have two sides of a market. You have, say, the products and customers, and you can randomize the products, you can randomize the customers, or you can randomize both at the same time. Exactly what are good designs there? It's going to depend on how the spillovers, how the interference arises. And so I think there's a lot of, so you need to put some structure on there, some economic structure on there. Right. So even for experimental design, it's not just about the statistics, it's about the economic content. Yeah. And so I think that's an interesting area. I think kind of more generally combining observational data and experimental data, I think is very interesting. I think kind of finding ways of making the graphical modeling have an impact in economics would be very interesting. Yeah. So I think there's still lots of stuff to be done in this area. Yeah. Well, it's such a fun time to see you, and I really appreciate you coming on here and letting me get to talk to you a little bit more. Congratulations again on No,
Great
no
year.
problem. Thanks for having me. I see the cat there in the background.
Yeah, this is Betty. She's I've got another one down there, Ronnie, but she hides in the box of paper. So
very good, very good.
Okay.
No, but I think it's great doing these things and sort of the other stuff you've done, as I said, with the AA 5K. I think some of the ways of building community and giving people some historical perspective is very helpful.
Yeah, I think I think that a lot of people don't know what economics is, and you can say, well, let me just give you a book or something, but I think we mainly kind of learn things from people and seeing people and learning their stories, and then we see who we want to be, and we kind of get attracted to the things that they're interested in. And it, for a field like economics, it's not like engineering or law. Nobody seems to get it right outside of the field, even what we do for a living.
Yeah, no. So as I said that, but I was teaching in the fall of 2020 when I started teaching online. I brought in a couple of guest speakers on Zoom. So I had Dan McFadden and Andrew Gellman. And the students just found it very interesting. And so next week I'll have Ed Lemer kind of talk about some of his stuff. I think that's great for the students to see.
Yeah. Well, thank you for letting me talk to you. I appreciate it a lot.
Great to talk to you, Scott.
Okay.
Take care.